I trusted a neighbor of mine too much only for me to be stabbed at the back. I never thought I could be betrayed like this, and I have learnt my lessons. I realized that not everyone can be trusted and a secret can't be hidden forever. No matter how you try to cover it, it will surely bring itself out. My name is Anna and I am 25 years old. I'm self-employed, and by that I mean that I own a coffee shop. The name of my fiancé is George, but we aren't together anymore because we just broke up last month. He is a 28-year-old real estate agent. George and I dated for 3 years and we have lived together for 2 years. We pretty much had an easygoing life and we were very much in love with each other. George and I met in my coffee shop on a very busy Monday morning. He came in and ordered coffee and there was a mix-up in the order. So I had to step in and apologize on behalf of my staff. I made a new coffee for him exactly how he wanted it. And from there, George and I got talking. We introduced ourselves and talked about our busy schedules. He told me about his work, we talked about a couple of things about ourselves, and we got to know each other. We exchanged contacts and he left a huge tip for me. I thanked him and got back to work. All through the day I remembered the time we had and I could smile. After a long day I returned home and I received a text from an unknown number and I discovered it was George. From there I saved his number and we got talking. I discovered he was a nice person, open-minded, he was a family-oriented guy. He lost his father at a very early age and he was raised by his mother. I also found out that George was the only boy out of 3 girls. He was very close to his sisters who meant everything to him. And the best of it all, he adored his mom. I kind of felt jealous because I didn't have that. I wasn't born into a big family and I didn't have siblings. I was an only child. Over the next few days, George could come to the coffee shop and we could talk and talk for hours. My workers noticed and began to tease me at some point. I never minded because George was easy to talk to and he was actually a genuine person. George wanted to know about my family at some point, but I told him that there was nothing much to it other than I was an only child raised by a single mother. My mother and I are not really close, but we talk once in a while. George and I were talking for some months and a few months later, he asked me out on a date. I was so happy because it was our first date and it felt so right because we had gotten to know each other so much. George knew how much I liked the little things and I told him I did not like celebrating my birthday in a big way. On the day of my birthday, he bought me a small piece of cake and we celebrated it quietly. I was very happy because I never liked celebrating my birthday since my mom forgot my birthday ever since I was 6 years old. So, I was very happy with his gesture. As time went on, I met George's mom. She was very welcoming and she told me a lot of stories about George when he was a child. His sisters were amazing, they were in high school and they were like every normal family. I felt welcomed and loved around them. So guys, I found out that George hardly eats home-cooked meals. He ate out a lot, so I decided to make lunch for him. I made lunch and sent it to his office, and during the evenings, I invited him over to my apartment for dinner. This went on for quite a while. We spent a lot of time together. At that time we were already a couple officially. George could spend the night at my place and I could also sleep over at his place. George was a very romantic guy, but at some point I did feel like I haven't done enough for him because he was the one that normally put a lot of effort in the relationship. He normally went the extra mile to spice things up and also make me feel special. I woke up one day and got dressed for work. I felt it was going to be a good day because as usual I got my morning call from George. We talked and he wished me the best for the day. I felt so lucky to have a very responsible and respectful boyfriend. I knew he was a very busy person during the day, so we normally talked in the mornings before work and the evenings if he is not working late. I discovered that being a real estate agent comes with a lot of work and dedication. He usually talks to me about his work and I enjoyed our talks because it was a different field from mine. I got to work and saw that there were people waiting for us to open. I said hi to Lucy and we got to work. I have a very good relationship with my employees and we normally relate well. We opened the shop and people began coming in and we started taking orders. Every day I feel happy about what I have built by myself. It always gave me immense joy to see my passion come to life. I decided to concentrate and I got back to work. It was indeed a busy morning. It was already noon when Helen, George's sister, came into the coffee shop. I have become really close with Helen ever since I started dating George. We had so much in common, we have the same likes and dislikes. I felt like she genuinely gets me. We usually talked about random things whenever we met. We both loved going to the movies, and we never missed an opportunity to do so. She could tell me how her brother was very lucky to have me as his girlfriend, and we could laugh about it. Helen left saying she had to get back to work, and we also went back to the kitchen to continue with my baking. I love baking so much, and I can say that was the only thing that brought my mother and I together. When I was little, she could teach me how to bake, and through that I learned a lot from her. I can say that was our own little bonding moment. Apart from that, my mother and I had nothing in common. It was almost evening when I was getting the pastries up front to the coffee shop when I received a call that my apartment had been consumed by fire. At that point, I didn't know how I felt, so I told Lucy to take care of the shop, and I told her what was happening at that time. I quickly rushed down towards my apartment building. I saw thick smoke coming out of the building. I cried my eyes out because I just lost my properties, and at that point I was already homeless. I tried calling George because he was the only one who could comfort me at that moment. His line was off. I knew he could be busy at that time, and so I called Helen because that was who would help me in that situation. I have no family, and the family that I had, which was my mother, was careless about me. Helen came over as fast as she could. I hugged her and cried on her shoulder. At that point, I felt defeated. I felt I had just lost everything. Helen calmed me down, and later, we found out that my neighbor who was on my floor had left their gas on. That was what started the fire in the first place. I was only glad that nobody was hurt in the fire, even though everything was damaged in my apartment. I couldn't enter the building because I did not want to feel even worse, so Helen took me to her place, and I did not know when I slept off. I kept thinking about how I am going to find my feet after losing so much that day. I felt completely exhausted. Not long after I woke up, George came, and I felt at peace that morning. He comforted me, and he asked me to come live with him. At first I was very skeptical about it, but at that point I had no option. Don't get me wrong, I loved George, but I didn't want to impose, but he was happy to let me stay with him. He told me I could stay with him and look for a place if that was going to make me feel better. I felt okay with that. Helen made dinner for us, but at that point I didn't feel like eating because I was feeling so sick to my stomach about what had happened. I thanked her for her help today, and we left for George's place. I know I am familiar with his place, but nothing beats having your own space. I was happy I got some of my clothes and toiletries in his place. I quickly settled in and got straight to bed. It had been an exhausting day. I felt like my whole life went up in that flame. I kept thinking of how alone I felt. George tried to comfort me, but he knew I wanted to be alone at that point. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I knew freshly baked pastries, so I followed the smell to the kitchen where I saw George making breakfast and Lucy baking some donuts. She quickly hugged, and all the emotions I felt from the day before hit me at once, and I started crying. I knew she understood how I worked to have my own place and everything else I have worked for. After some time I felt better, and we talked about the shop and how she was running things. I told her to take over for some time because I didn't think I was ready for work at that moment. George agreed with me, and we ate breakfast together before George left for work that day. Lucy left also because she had to go open the coffee shop. I felt like I needed to just be alone for a while and take everything in as the day went by. I decided to start looking for a place as soon as possible, but the apartments I was seeing were too far from the city, and I didn't want to live too far away because of my shop. George called me to check on me from time to time. I told him to not worry about me and for him to concentrate on work. Not too long I received a call from George's mom consoling me about what happened. At that moment I felt at peace because of the motherly care and warmth she always gives me. Indeed, she was like a mother to me. We talked for a while, and she tried to cheer me up, which she succeeded because she was a lovely person who cared with all her heart. It was evening, and I decided to make dinner. George returned from work, and we talked about his day and what I did that day. I told him I had started looking for a place. I felt his mood change at some point and I knew he didn't want me to start looking for a place this early. He told me to quit the search and that his house was big enough for the both of us to live together. I was very happy that George really cared for me and he was very intentional about us. We ate dinner and we went to bed together that night. The following morning was Saturday. George and I woke up together and went for a morning exercise. I was never the type that usually does workout, but I picked interests when I started living with George. It was really nice back then doing morning workouts with him. We went back home and we made breakfast together. We teased ourselves and also joked about a lot of things that had happened on our first date. Cooking with George was really fun and nice. He knew how to bring the best in me and I felt safe with him. Few weeks of moving into George's house was bittersweet for me. It was sweet because I was with someone that genuinely cared about me. It was bitter because I kept on thinking about the amount of things I lost to the fire outburst in my apartment. I had lots of childhood memories that got burnt down. I felt like I was starting life all over again. It wasn't easy back then, but I survived with the help of George, his family, and Lucy. Those were the ones that stood by me during my trying times. The few times I spent at George's house was nice. I noticed the house across the street was empty. I told George about it in our usual conversations. He said that the house had been empty for a very long time, but few days later I saw that someone had moved in and I didn't know how to feel about the new neighbor because I thought maybe they weren't the friendly type because I usually stay in George's house throughout the day by myself feeling bored, so I thought to myself a new neighbor could be good. I made plans to go say hi to them, but somehow I never got around to doing it, and so time passed and I got back to work. Resuming work after my loss was very challenging at first, but I later got used to it. Thanks to Lucy, she managed in my absence and she did a good job. She made sure everything was fine and running. I was grateful I had someone that took care of my business. Thanks to George and his family, I was emotionally ready to find my feet again. Some of my very loyal customers who heard about what happened to me came to welcome me and even gave me gifts. I was very thankful for their kind gesture. It really cheered me up. I started working fully feeling very optimistic about the future. Few weeks went by and work was great in George and I continued our usual check-in with each other. It was different this time because now we lived together and we saw each other daily. We grew stronger in our relationship and also things were moving swiftly. George spent a lot on me in the period we lived together. He single-handedly took over buying me more clothes and toiletries when I lost everything. He practically saved me. I was so grateful, and so I decided since I resumed work fully, I made up my mind to pay him back for his generosity, which he declined, saying I should not worry about it. I left work early one day and I decided to rest because we had a busy week. I gave Lucy and the rest of my employees the day off and left after closing the shop. I was driving in when I saw the back of the new neighbor standing across the street. I made a mental note to go say hi later in the day, after making dinner and since I had enough time to spare before George arrived from work. I looked across the street and went there. I knocked for about 2 minutes without anybody responding. It felt weird and so I left the front porch. I thought I saw someone when I was driving in, but then I thought maybe they were not around. George came back and I told him about my experience with the new neighbor, which he said maybe they were not around, which I saw reasons with him. Early one Sunday morning, George had a family emergency and left early hours of the morning. He had lost his uncle and he needed to be there. I felt like I needed to be there with him, but he declined, saying that he needed to do it alone. I was okay with it because I didn't want to push it and upset him, and so he left. I was doing some work around the house when I saw a lady entering the house of the new neighbor. He must be a people's person because people do come and go all the time. I thought to myself maybe our new neighbor isn't the friendly type because it has been weeks since they parked in and he hasn't said hello to us. I thought to myself maybe I should just let them be like George suggested. I called George that evening and we spoke about the trip. I felt bad for not being there for him because I later found out that his uncle was the closest thing he had to a father after his father died. He told me how he was there for them, and at that moment I felt like giving him a hug and taking the pains he was feeling away. Don't get me wrong, George was a strong and independent guy, but I knew that moment he needed to be comforted. I sympathized with him on the phone and told him everything would be okay. We ended the call and I slept off. The following day, I got up trying to reach George to find out if he was okay, but his lines were off. So, I got up and started preparing for the day. I made breakfast and I was finishing up when I had the doorbell. I knew it was not George or any of his family members, and definitely, Lucy would have called before coming over. I went to open the door and saw somebody that I didn't know. He introduced himself as Christopher, the new neighbor across the street, and I also introduced myself as Anna, and I told him I lived here with my boyfriend. I felt like I needed to let him know about the other day. He apologized and said that he was not around. So I asked him how I could help him. He said he was having issues with his plumbing and that he needed the number of our plumber. I wrote down the number and gave it to him, which he thanked me for and left. I closed the door and went back cleaning up before leaving for work. At that moment, I thought to myself that Christopher was very good looking. I dismissed the thought and went on with the rest of my day. I got to the coffee shop. I talked with Lucy for some time on our weekly delivery, which hadn't come in yet. I decided to look over at our account when I got a call from George. He apologized for not being reachable. He said he needed to put off his phone for the burial ceremony. I told him I understood and I asked him how it went. He said it went okay, and we talked about some other things before I brought up my encounter with Christopher. I told him how polite Christopher was because I had a not so good impression of him. Because I thought he was a snub. George asked me what the neighbor wanted and I told him he has issues with his pipes and he needed a plumber, of which I gave him the number of our plumber. We talked on the phone for a while and I needed to get back to work and we said our goodbyes. Few hours later, I rounded up my work and went home. I was very tired because we had a lot of work. I got home and I headed straight to the bed because I was very exhausted. Not long after I got in, Christopher came knocking again, but this time he came thanking me for the help I rendered to him earlier that morning. I asked him if his plumbing issues were fixed already, and he said yes, the number was helpful. I told him I was happy to help. He asked about George and wanted to say hello. I told him he went out of town for a funeral. He sympathized and he headed back to his house. After talking with Christopher, I actually felt like I misjudged him because he looked like a nice person. I wished George was around at that moment. Maybe they could be friends, but I didn't want to jinx it though. George can be very dominating if he wants to be, and I know that not everybody liked that part of him, and that's one of the reasons he does not have many friends. He has this commanding presence and so many people feel small around him. I hope he actually becomes friends with Christopher because I believe they could bond fast, or at least I hoped they had something in common. Over the next few days, George returned from the trip. I missed him so much because the whole house became so boring and dull without him. He had a lot to share with me about his trip, which I was eager to listen to because I love to hear him speak. We talked for a while and we went to bed. The next morning, George went to work quite early and I decided to also open the coffee shop a little that day because the weather was not too friendly. I saw Christopher on his front porch and I waved at him while he waved back. I got into the shop and opened it in the afternoon. Things had been going smoothly at the shop and I decided it was time to take off for myself. I invited Helen for movie night at George's house later that day in the evening. It has definitely been so long since we saw each other. I went back home to prepare for her arrival. I was getting the popcorn when I heard the doorbell. I quickly opened the door and saw Helen. We hugged and we started on selecting a movie. Helen told me she saw a very handsome guy across the street when she was driving in, and I told her he was our new neighbor. I knew with the way Helen talked about him she had interest in Christopher. She asked me if he had a girlfriend, to which I said no because I didn't know him that much. We just met a few days ago. I told her maybe you should go over there and introduce yourself if you like him, and she said that could be too forward. We settled for a good movie and we watched and laughed. Halfway into the movie, George came back from work, freshened up and joined us to complete the movie. Later, Helen left since it was getting late and she needed to go home. George and I went to bed and I was thinking about what Helen had said. I couldn't sleep because I had several imaginations playing in my head. I eventually managed to sleep off after a while. It had been 2 days since I had seen Christopher last. So, I thought of checking up on him. I went over to his house and I saw the door unlocked. I knocked twice before Christopher came out. We greeted each other and I said I just wanted to say hi and that I would get going, but he told me to come in and have a drink. I declined, but after much persuasion from him, I accepted his invitation. He told me it was his own little way of appreciating me for the other day. So I went in to have a drink with him. We talked about so many things and even talked about his life experience. Christopher told me that he was a personal assistant he said was really proud of what he does, and I could see the passion in his eyes. I equally told him I owned my own coffee shop, to which he said he was proud of me for what I had accomplished. I told him about how the fire had burnt down my apartment, to which he felt sorry for me. We talked about some random things like how I discovered that he was really into sports. He played baseball and soccer. I thought to myself that George was more into baseball, so I didn't see them having anything in common. Christopher and I got so deep into the conversation that I didn't notice that I had spent more than an hour. I wanted to end the conversation, but then again he was very good at making jokes. I enjoyed watching him talk and cracking those funny jokes. Christopher could make jokes about his boss, and that could crack me up. I was finally able to leave because it was getting late and George would be coming home anytime soon and I needed to prepare his dinner before he got back from work. Christopher walked me up to my door and said he would like for us to spend time together like this again. I smiled and told him I would if I had time to spare because I had my hands full with my coffee shop, and he left. I got inside and I felt excited because I had just found someone to talk to in this neighborhood. I headed straight to the kitchen to prepare something for my boyfriend, George. I was preparing his meal when he drove into the garage. I went to the door and welcomed him. I asked how his day went and we hugged. George also asked about my day and I told him it went well. He said he would join me in the few minutes that he needed to freshen up, so he went upstairs. While he went upstairs, I set the table for us to eat together. Few minutes later, George came downstairs and joined me on the table. We were eating and having our usual conversations when I told him about my visit to our new neighbor's house, Christopher. I noticed his mood changed and he told me he doesn't like the idea of me visiting Christopher at his house. I got angry and asked why that was a problem, but he didn't say anything and he got up and left. He said he wasn't interested in eating and that he had lost his appetite. All efforts to call him back were in vain. George went upstairs and I went to join him after I finished clearing up the table. I went upstairs and saw that George had already slept off. I laid on the other side of the bed and I was thinking about my experience with Christopher. Everything that happened between me and George didn't bother me because I didn't see anything wrong in going to say hello to a new neighbor. The conversation Christopher and I had that day kept on playing in my head. I smiled after remembering some of his jokes he had told me. Somehow, I dozed off a few minutes later. The next day I woke up and didn't find George on the bed. I went downstairs and saw him already dressed for work and making coffee. We greeted each other and he said he would get going. I nodded my head and he left. I quickly made breakfast and got dressed and went to my coffee shop. So guys, on getting to my coffee shop I saw how things were moving and I was quite impressed with Lucy. She didn't bother me about anything and managed to serve all the customers. I only helped out with a few things. I went and sat at my usual spot where I normally called George on the phone, but he wasn't picking up. Maybe he was still angry about last night, I thought to myself. I tried a few times, but no response, so I didn't stress further. While I was trying to reach out to my boyfriend, I noticed that a familiar face had walked in, so I got up from where I was to have a look. When I got to the counter I saw that the familiar face was Christopher. I went closer to him and said hi and asked what he came to do. He was surprised to see me and said he stepped out to get a coffee and that this place was the only nearby shop close to his house. At that moment, I was very happy to see him again. He asked me what I came there to do and I told him I owned the place. Christopher was very surprised by that and told me I had a really nice space. I smiled and asked if his order had been sorted out and he said he was waiting for it. I told him to take a seat and wait while I brought it out for him. I quickly packaged his order and gave it to him. He said he couldn't stay longer because he needed to go somewhere and that he would come back some other time and stay to have it there, so he left in a hurry and I bade him. Goodbye. After Christopher left, I wondered why he was in so much haste to leave. Maybe he must have had an urgent call. I thought to myself while I was heading back to the shop. I went home that day and I headed straight to Christopher's house. I met him trashing out the waste bin and we greeted each other. I told him I came to ask if everything was okay because he had rushed out from the shop earlier that day. He said he was sorry that he needed to attend to something and that everything was fine. I felt happy that it wasn't something serious and I told him I would get going and he nodded. Few days went by and George and I finally came back to our regular routine. I discovered that me speaking or visiting Christopher didn't sit well with him, but at that time, I thought maybe because he hadn't even met the guy that's why he was not being too friendly. George and I were watching the sun set on our front porch when a fancy SUV drove into Christopher's front porch. I thought to myself maybe it was his boss's because I knew he was working for a very big person according to his description about his boss. When the person came out of the car, I discovered it was a woman with a very expensive taste. By this time George received a call and he had left to take it. I saw the lady entering Christopher's house and I didn't think much about it. He was really a friendly person and definitely he must have a lot of friends. At work the following day, I decided to speak with Lucy about us expanding in our different pastries, which she saw reasons with me. I love to have her input in my business because she was really good at bringing up ideas and we have been running this shop for years. We were rounding up our meeting when Lucy asked me when I was going to look for my own place and she said I shouldn't be comfortable staying with George in this manner. I found reasons with what she said, but I know I was just still finding my feet. I didn't think much into what she said because I knew it was coming from a good place. We got back to work and we decided to start making the new pastries. George called me late in the afternoon saying that his mother wanted to have us over for dinner. I was happy because I loved his family. They were very welcoming anytime I came over. I told Lucy about the dinner and she asked me to go home early and get ready for the dinner, to which I was very happy because she was going to close up the shop. I went home and on arriving home I saw that the same SUV from the order day was parked in front of Christopher's house. I didn't have much time to spare so I went straight to our room to get ready for dinner. I decided to wear one of my favorite dresses and went with minimal makeup. I decided to take a bottle of wine with me for the evening. I called George to come back early so we could go together. Guys, a few minutes later he was at home and he got ready and we were on our way. We got into random conversations before we got to his mother's house. She welcomed us at the door and her hugs were always motherly. She had this voice that instantly calmed me down anytime I was moody. I met with his sisters and I discovered Helen wasn't around as at the time we arrived, but came a few minutes later and joined us before we started eating. We talked and made random conversations around the table. You could see the dynamics between George and his siblings. They were very close and we later found out that Helen had a boyfriend she was keeping from everyone because she didn't want her family to tease her about it. Helen told us a story of how George had always chased away boys from her when she was in school. She said she never had male friends in school and she was afraid that this time he might scare off her boyfriend. George's mother then asked Helen to introduce him to the family if it was really serious, which she accepted. I could see George was not having it. He didn't want to see his sisters with any guy because he thought they were not going to treat them well. We finished eating and decided to leave before George's mother started packing some of the leftovers for us to take home. I thanked her and we got on our way. I could see the smile on George's face. He always felt at peace wherever he was with his family. I wished we did this more often, but I knew we were both busy. We got home and George told me he still had work to finish, so I made him a cup of coffee. I freshened up and went to bed. I made a mental note to go see my mother after a long time since I knew she was not going to reach out first. My mom and I haven't seen each other for a year now, so I decided to go see her the next day. I woke up the next morning to go see my mom. I told George about my plans and he picked interest in going with me. Ever since George and I started dating, he hadn't gotten a chance to see her. Well, it wasn't his fault. My mom never really cared that much about me. Just like George said, I waited for him to come back from work that evening before we headed straight to my mom's. We arrived at my mom's house and everything was still the same. She wasn't surprised to see me after all this while. She asked me who George was and I introduced him to her. George acted nice towards her and even gave her that respect he always gives his mom. They kept on talking like they had known each other for a long time and even forgot I was there with them. Somehow, I managed to end whatever they were saying and told my mom that George and I needed to leave. My boyfriend looked at me and asked if everything was okay, and I said yes. We got up and George promised my mom that he would come see her again. He hugged her and we went to the car and we drove off. On our way, George noticed I wasn't really in a good mood and he asked what the matter was. I didn't want to spoil the evening further, so I told him not to worry. My response didn't sit well with him, but he didn't stress further, so he let me be. So guys, a few days after seeing my mom, I felt like I had let go of a big burden off my chest. I felt at peace and carried on with my normal life. So one morning, I called Lucy and told her I wouldn't be coming to the shop that day because I needed to rest. I always counted on Lucy because she was ready to help anytime I called. I got off the phone with her and I headed outside to take a morning exercise in order for me to clear my head. George had left early to work that day, so I was left alone. On my way back from my jogging, I met Christopher on the way. We greeted each other and he went on to tell me about how he has been busy and how he hadn't been able to talk to me ever since. I told him it was fine because I knew everybody had something to do. One of the things I liked about Christopher is the ability for him to make me smile. I was always laughing whenever I was with him. I asked him to come over for a cup of coffee, which he accepted. He came inside and I asked him if he was supposed to be at work at that time. He proceeded to tell me that his boss was on vacation and he gave him the rest of the week off. We chatted for some time and I discovered he was a very charming guy. There were times Christopher flirted with me. He left saying he needed to get on with the morning, and I totally forgot I went for a run. Maybe I was even sticking to him. I quickly took my bath and I decided to rest for the rest of the day. A week had passed and I didn't see or hear from Christopher. I kind of missed his vibe because he was literally a breath of fresh air. Like every other busy day, I was in my coffee shop attending to customers when Christopher walked into the shop. I asked Lucy to attend to him and that I would be with him shortly. I finished with the last customer for the morning and went to sit with Christopher. He told me that he had time to spare since his boss was having lunch across the street with his family. We continued to talk and he pointed out that he hadn't yet met George and I had to explain that he was really busy and I would introduce them soon. Christopher continued his flirting and at some point I gave in to his charm. He had told me at some point that he had liked me, but I didn't see it as anything because Christopher played a lot, but looking back now I feel like there were signs that he had feelings for me and I didn't pay attention to it. I wished I was more attentive, maybe I could have quickly detected his intentions. Christopher invited me to attend a business party his boss was organizing with him and I did not know what to say. I felt like that was too forward considering I had a boyfriend. I told him I was going to think about it. I honestly wanted to go because I wanted to leave the house and even find out what these kinds of corporate events are like. Christopher left after his boss called him to come over. I kept on pondering about his invitation. I didn't want to tell George about it because I knew he was not going to allow it and he could totally stop me from ever talking with Christopher. The worst part was that he didn't know about us meeting like this. I knew that could cause a big problem between us, so I never told him about our meetings. I decided to speak with Lucy about this invitation, to which she clearly put down saying it was not okay for me to accept such an invitation. I told her I and Christopher were just friends and that there was nothing extra, but she said I only knew there was nothing extra from my end. She had said what if Christopher had other intentions? And I told her she was overthinking it. Lucy didn't push further and I was happy she didn't. I went home and I wanted to talk to George, but I decided not to because he could not understand and he might just make things complicated between us. I decided to go see Christopher and ask him for the details about the event. He was very happy that I decided to attend the party with him. He told me it was going to be fun because there was a lot to eat and marry. I asked for the dress code for the event, he gave me every detail and he said the party was in 3 days. At that point I was already thinking about the type of lie I was going to give George. The day for the event came and I decided it was safe for me to get dressed at the coffee shop. Since George was going to be at home and I didn't want to tell him where I was going to, I told him a client of mine was having an event and he had told us to bring some pastries for his event and so I will be home late. He agreed and I left the house that morning with my dress and everything I needed for the evening. I was so happy he bought my lies. I got to the coffee shop and went about my normal routine. I called Christopher to come pick me up at the coffee shop anytime he would be going to the party. I instructed Lucy not to let my boyfriend, George, know about it and she should cover up for me should he come around. Lucy was hesitant at first because she felt like it was a bad idea for me to attend the party with Christopher without George's knowledge. She had no choice but to keep into what I had instructed her. So guys, the time of the party came and Christopher came to pick me up in my coffee shop. We arrived at the venue 30 minutes to the time. The party was scheduled at 7 o'clock in the evening and lasted till 12 and the following morning. The party was a very simple one. Nothing extra or big. I was a bit uncomfortable because I didn't know anyone at the party except Christopher. I sat at a corner and watched Christopher meeting up with a lot of people at the event. I must say, he knew quite a number of people. Well, he was a personal assistant so I didn't expect much. Few minutes later, Christopher came and met me where I was seated. He asked if I was okay and apologized for keeping waiting for that long. I told him I was fine and that I came here to have fun. I hadn't gone out to party with George for some time now and I really missed coming out to attend parties. Christopher laughed and said he was surprised to hear that. He thought George and I always went out together. I told him we had only attended family dinner or lunch together but definitely not parties. George was never the type that likes attending events, especially not parties. And he asked, what about me? If I liked going out to parties. I told him yes, that Elle liked attending events and also loved to party. He smiled and stretched out his hands towards me and said I should have a dance with him. I felt very happy and I accepted wholeheartedly. Christopher and I danced to the sound of the music and I enjoyed every bit of the steps we took. I was very excited that I was dancing with Christopher. The guy I had always had a crush on. Yes, guys. Christopher was that charming and it felt good dancing with him. It looked like we had something going on between the two of us. At that moment I wanted to ask if Christopher had a girlfriend but then again I didn't because I didn't want to ruin the moment. And most importantly, it was never my business to ask such a personal question. If he had had a girlfriend, he would have literally let me know about it or even brought his girlfriend to the party instead of me. I wanted to enjoy the moment so I went with the flow. We danced for a while before the music went off. Christopher commended my dancing steps and didn't seize a moment to compliment on my dressing. I felt shy and smiled. Christopher knew how to tease me. It wasn't so hard for him to do it. We both went back to the table and sat down. Christopher and I were talking about the dance when he was called by his boss to come over to where he was. So guys, Christopher left and I was left alone at the table again. But this time, Christopher kept on stealing glances at me while he was conversing with his boss. Few minutes later, I got a text message from George. He texted to know if everything was okay with me. Immediately, I gave him a call that I would be home in 30 minutes time. The party was almost coming to an end and I signaled Christopher to come over. After a while he came and I told him I needed to go because it was getting late. He told me to wait so he could give me a ride. I declined because I didn't want my boyfriend to see me getting down from his car and that I could find my way home. He saw reasons with me and gave me a hug. Yes, guys. We hugged. Christopher thanked me for coming and I left the party. Not long after I came out from the venue, I got a cab and headed home. The night was pleasant and I had a great day. I went back home and saw that George had slept off on the couch. He must have been waiting for me to get back home. I quickly went upstairs and freshened up and changed my clothes so he wouldn't suspect anything. I later went downstairs and woke him up so we could go to sleep together. So guys, I went to bed and retired for the night. I came back from the shop like every other day. I was so tired because we had a lot of customers that day. I was surprised to see George's car parked outside, he was never home this early. I went in and saw him with a very tired and angry look. I knew immediately that something was definitely wrong, so I asked him what the problem was, and he said that our neighbor came by looking for me, and when I invited him in, he knew every corner of the house. He looked relaxed and comfortable like he has been here before. I didn't know what to say. I told him I invited him over for coffee a few times, and he got so angry and started shouting at me, saying I shouldn't be inviting another man into the house I was sharing with my boyfriend. I tried to make him see reasons with me that I am just friends with him, but at that point I didn't know what else to do but to beg George to calm down. He left the house angrily, and I didn't know when I started crying. I cried my eyes out that very night, and I waited for George to come back home, but he never did. The following morning I was so tired from all the crying and stress of the previous day, and I decided to take the day off and also give Lucy the day off too. I called him, but he didn't pick up or return any of my messages. That was the first time that George slept outside since we started dating. I knew he must be really angry with me to do that. I cried because I knew it was all my fault. So guys, the next day, I heard a knock on the door. I thought it was George, so I hurriedly left to go open the door, but I discovered it was Christopher. He had come to check up on me since he went to my shop and it was closed. I explained to him about what was going on and he consoled me. I hugged him and cried my eyes out. I knew I shouldn't have done that, but at that point I needed a shoulder to cry on. George had never spoken to me in the manner that he did, and he had never for once slept out. It was very overwhelming. I never knew that Christopher saw that moment as an opportunity to move close to me. I didn't know when I slept off due to the warmth that was coming off Christopher's body. I woke up hours later to see that it was already dark outside. I couldn't imagine sleeping the whole day. I stood up and I went to get something in the kitchen, and I saw Christopher in the kitchen preparing dinner. I asked him why he was still around because I was afraid what would George say or even do if he had seen him in the house with me. I didn't know what to do, and I asked him to leave at once. He refused and said that he wasn't leaving because he wants to be here to protect me from George. I was very tired and decided to stop fighting with him because he was only trying to help. Christopher suggested we watch a movie, to which I agreed. I knew that it could somehow cheer me up. We watched the movie together with Christopher holding me in his arms. I knew that it was wrong because I was finding solace in another man's arms while having issues with my boyfriend, but at that time I decided to stop thinking about George and thought about my happiness. I gave in to Christopher's advances and we ended up in bed together. I knew what I was doing was wrong at that point, but I threw caution to the wind because I didn't know where George was at the time and I needed to be comforted. The following morning, I woke up to see that I was alone in bed. I didn't know what we had meant anything to Christopher that he had to leave me alone in bed. I felt hurt and I got up to go freshen up for work. I knew I gave Lucy time to rest, but it was time I got back to work. As I was leaving the house, I saw that Christopher was also coming out. I decided to avoid talking to him, but he walked across the street before I could drive off. He apologized for leaving early, saying he had a family emergency and his mother was taken to the hospital. I felt sorry for him, and in a minute I forgot I was even angry at him. He told me he had a very nice night and he wished it could happen more often. I smiled and I drove off. I never even thought about George throughout that period. I felt light and I was very happy. I got to work and got started on everything before customers started coming in. I love my work because it has always helped me to take my mind off a lot of things. I made little conversations with my employees when I had time because I hadn't told Lucy that I had opened the shop because I wanted her to rest since she had been holding things down for me whenever I was not around. It was past 10 in the night and I decided to close the shop and my employees left. I sat in silence thinking about everything that had happened for the past few days. I couldn't imagine that George could go radio silent on me in that manner. I closed up and went home. I went, but I didn't want to reach out to George's family because I didn't want to alarm them. I got home and decided to make dinner when I heard the door opening, and I knew it was George because no one could walk into the house like that. I went to him to say hi, but he gave me a cold shoulder. I begged him to forgive me, to which he agreed after much persuasion. I knew he couldn't stay angry with me for so long, but not before warning me to stay away from Christopher or else we could go our separate ways. I accepted, but I kept thinking how I am going to stay away from Christopher after the time we had. Week went by, George and I were back to our normal lives. We went on regular dates, and I felt like the disagreement had brought us even closer because everything was back to normal and even better. George was leaving work early to be with me, and he was even getting me gifts. I honestly believed at some point that he was thinking that he was not doing enough. That was why I was friendly with another man, because he started to be attentive to me. Christopher hadn't reached out to me for a while. I hope he wasn't avoiding me? I thought to myself. I hardly saw him around, but I noticed the same SUV I saw when he recently came to the neighborhood was back, and the car had been parked on his front porch for days. Is it that his boss was now living with him? I asked myself. So, I decided to go pay him a visit because I honestly missed him. I went to knock on the door. I waited for a few seconds when a lady in her mid-20s opened the door. I introduced myself and told her I was one of Christopher's neighbors from across the street. She introduced herself as Christopher's girlfriend. I was very shocked because I never knew he had a girlfriend, and most importantly, why didn't he tell me? I told her I just wanted to say hello and left. I left there feeling very ashamed of myself because I felt like I was lied to and even took advantage of. Days went by and I was able to see Christopher. As I was going to my shop one morning, I saw Christopher trying to drive out. I quickly stepped out of my car and went to where he was. I asked him why he had been avoiding me, but he didn't give a good explanation. I genuinely felt like I was being used. I also asked him why he had a girlfriend and didn't tell me about it, because I thought he was single. He told me the reason why he didn't tell me was because I didn't ask. I was genuinely hurt because I thought we had something special. I let out all the emotions I was feeling at that point in my tears. Christopher started comforting me by hugging me. I was lost in the hug, and all of a sudden, Christopher pushed me away. I was startled and I discovered that his girlfriend appeared out of nowhere. Christopher was trying to explain things to her when I left there. I went home and I started thinking about the kind of problem I had put myself in. I concluded on not going anywhere that day. Few days later, Christopher came by the shop explaining everything to me. Unknown to me that he was trying to deceive me. Christopher said he was in love with me and that he didn't love his current girlfriend. I am the one he wanted. I didn't know why I did not see through his lies. He told me I should leave my boyfriend and he will leave his girlfriend so that we can live together and make our relationship work. He told me that we should keep our relationship low-key for now since his girlfriend was coming to live with him for some time because she was being suspicious of USL. I believed him and I started to give George an attitude, not knowing that I was being deceived. George and I had regular fights, because I was angry with him all the time for no reason. At that time, everything he did was irritating to me. Looking back and seeing the things I did, I know I am very wrong and ashamed writing this. I was giving him a hard time for something he didn't even know about. There were days I could leave the house and travel out of town with Christopher without telling George where I was going. Christopher became my peace at some point. I just needed to get away from George. George at some point thought I was overwhelmed with work, and that was the reason why I was taking it out on him. He decided to give me space, and he took the 1-week work trip that he was offered in his office. George told me about the trip the morning he was leaving. I was so mad that he didn't tell me, and we had a little disagreement before he left. I had the whole house to myself, and I was happy that I was not going to see George for some time. Christopher kept assuring me that he was going to break up with his girlfriend, but I kept waiting, but it didn't happen. I later began to see less and less of Christopher. I decided to talk to someone because I was not feeling good about the situation I was in. So guys, I invited Lucy over and I narrated everything to her. She was very disappointed in me and I saw it in her eyes. She asked me why I did that to George. I didn't know what to say, but what I knew at that point, I loved Christopher. She told me that I should speak with George, but I decided to speak with him after Christopher had broken up with his girlfriend and we were together officially. She looked at me in disbelief and was surprised by what I said. At that moment, she knew my mind was already made up, so she didn't stress further. Guys, after a long time I wasn't able to reach out to Christopher. He was obviously avoiding me and I needed to talk to him. I gave him 3 days to break up with his girlfriend like he promised, but it was more than that 3 days. So I got ready and went to his house. I was about to knock when the door opened. It was Christopher, trying to avoid me. I asked him what happened and why he ghosted me for 4 days, and if he had broken up with his girlfriend. I tried entering, but he stopped me. Before I could say anything, Christopher dragged me from the door and bluntly told me that he couldn't break up with his girlfriend to be with me. Yes. Christopher told me that. I didn't believe my ears and leaned to the wall. He told me that he didn't want to see us again because his girlfriend suspected something suspicious about us. At that moment, I was very surprised and ashamed of myself. I just fell for a trap set by Christopher. He told me he can't break up with his girlfriend because she's the pioneer of his feeding and clothing. He came closer to me because he had thought that I had money because I owned a coffee but never knew I was more broke than him. After hearing all that from Christopher, I didn't know when I started crying. I tried talking to him, but he banged the door at my face. I went home and laid down on the bed and cried my eyes out. I was deceived and used by Christopher. I was very foolish to fall into the trap he had set. I never knew he was that wicked and heartless. He used me to take away time whenever his girlfriend was not around. I felt very ashamed. 2 days had passed since Christopher told me those awful things. I didn't want to back out so early, so I kept messaging and calling him, but he didn't reply or respond to my calls. Since my boyfriend George was back from his work trip the next day, I went to see Christopher again if he would have a change of mind before I decided on what to do. I went to his house, but this time it was the lady I met the other day. Stacy, Christopher's girlfriend. She looked at me like someone that was mentally ill. Yes, with the way I was then, I looked unkempt. Before I could say anything, she told me to not come back to Christopher's place again. She told me whatever Christopher and I had was a mistake that shouldn't have happened. Stacy also told me that Christopher explained everything that happened. She said Christopher told her that I was the one that threw myself at him and he was stupid enough to fall for me. She also said Christopher told her that I seduced him and made several advances towards him. I was shocked to the extent that I opened my mouth in disbelief. I tried to explain everything to Stacy, but she didn't let me and yelled at me to leave immediately. I left in utmost disgust. I felt irritated about what I had heard from Stacy. Why did Christopher have to lie about our secret affairs? If he was living off his girlfriend's money, why did he paint me that bad to her just to play safe? I went to my house and wallowed in self-pity. Everything that I had achieved was coming to crumble right in front of my eyes. 3 days later, I got a call from George. He told me he was going to return that day. I was scared that I didn't know what to do if he found out about my affair with Christopher. I didn't plan on telling him anything about it. I wanted to act like all of this never happened and move on with my life. I got off the phone with George and went about my normal routine. I didn't go to work because I needed some time to clear my head. I also didn't tell Lucy about Christopher breaking up with me because I felt embarrassed. I can't stand making a fool of myself twice. Few hours later, George arrived home. I asked him about the trip and he said it was fine. We acted normal and behaved like nothing happened before he left for the trip. 10 minutes later, he changed into his housewares and had his meal. The next morning, I finally decided to go to my coffee shop to see how things were. It had already been a week, so I needed to step out at least to distract myself from the heartbreak. I got to the coffee shop and I met Lucy as usual. The moment she saw me, she knew that everything wasn't okay. She gave me a seat and asked what was wrong. I didn't say anything before tears were running down my eyes. I couldn't muster the courage to tell her I had been dumped by Christopher. Lucy read through my eyes and she hugged me and told me everything was going to be fine. I somehow managed to narrate all what had happened, but at that time, I cried profusely. While Lucy was trying to calm me down, my phone rang and it turned out to be George. I cleaned my eyes before I picked the phone and said hello. George yelled at me and demanded I come back home now. I was confused because I didn't know what I did that made him shout the way he did. It hadn't been long since I left home. Why is George asking me to come back? I asked myself. I left Lucy and headed home straight. I got home and saw George acting ferocious. I got more scared because I hadn't seen him that way since we started dating. He grabbed me by my arm and asked me if I had in any way cheated on him. I got so scared that I didn't know what to say at that moment. He yelled at me and asked what business I had with Christopher. Before I could say anything, Christopher pushed me down. I didn't know what to say at that moment because George had already known about secret affairs with Christopher. I was shattered. Update. Hi guys, I hope you all still remembered me. I'm here to complete my story and I hope you stay here and listen. Hoping to hear from you all again because the comments are always extra. Even though I'm being roasted in the comments, it's still always nice to get some feedback. So guys, I later discovered that Christopher and Stacy teamed up against me and went to tell George about my secret affairs. George called me immediately after Christopher and Stacy left the house. I couldn't give any reasonable explanation to George because I know what I did was wrong. After the confrontation from George that morning after I left my coffee shop, George left the house and didn't come back for days. I called him, but his lines were off. I got a lot of calls and messages from George's family. Everyone wanted to know what exactly went wrong. I didn't pick or return any of those messages or calls because I had no reasonable explanation to give them. I used my hands to destroy the little family I was starting to build. George and his family were nice and kind to me. They were the family I never had. I was really ashamed of myself. Few days after George left home, I got a call from him. He told me that I should move out of his house and he didn't want to ever set his eyes on me again. He told me he was done with the relationship and asked me to leave immediately. Before I could say anything, George hung up on me. I called him back to see if I could beg him, but he didn't pick my call. I felt heartbroken. George only showed me nothing but love and care. Is this how I'm going to repay him for his generosity? I thought to myself and cried. I trusted Christopher. I thought he was a good guy, but I never thought he was this wicked. He even went the extra mile to ruin my life by teaming up with Stacy. I went over to Christopher's house, but I discovered he had moved out from his apartment. So he decided to move out after ruining my life? Why did he have to betray me this way? I kept asking myself. Even if George had to know about my affair, I should be the one to tell him, not him learning the truth from outside. George gave me 24 hours to park out of his apartment before he returned. I eventually moved because I didn't want George to come meet me there. So I went and rented an apartment miles away from our neighborhood. It had been 2 weeks since I parked out and George hadn't called me yet. I kept on calling George, but he didn't pick up. So guys, one day I decided to go see him. I really wanted to explain everything to him. I met him at the front porch trying to trash the waste bin. I told him that I really wanted to say something to him. He didn't allow me and reminded me how disgusted he was seeing me at that moment. He told me that I stooped so low by seducing our neighbor and even threw myself at him even though he kept rejecting me. I went down on my knees and held onto his leg begging him to hear my own side of the story, but he pushed me away. He told me that he shouldn't see me here again or call him because he was going to block my lines. So guys, I left George's house feeling devastated. I couldn't believe that I was betrayed by my own affair partner who was my neighbor. I have learned my lesson and I totally feel disappointed in myself writing this right now. George broke up with me and moved on with his life. It was very difficult for me because I loved George and didn't know what I was thinking that I cheated on him. George's family, especially Helen, wouldn't want to speak to me or have anything to do with me. Of course they were angry and had every right to. They took me like one of them and I messed things up. George's mom didn't want to see me because I didn't pick up the phone when she called me the time they learned about the truth. George must have told them to cut all communications with me. How I wish I was given a chance to air my own side of the story. I wanted to clarify things. My whole life crumbled in front of me in seconds. I messed the whole thing up by trusting Christopher. He tricked me into believing that he was going to break up with Stacy. I fell for it. So guys, I hope you all learned something from my story. Never trust anyone unless you know they are worthy to be trusted. I trusted my neighbor Christopher too much and he betrayed me by telling George about our secret affairs. He said the truth not because he was remorseful about what had happened, but because he wanted to protect himself. I'm not trying to blame him for my mistake because I'm an adult and I'm responsible for any decision I take. That is my story, guys. Hoping to hear what you all think about this, and also I hope you would not make the same mistake I made.